Fireball. So, this is my spellcasting system. Hi, I'm Clip. But how did I make it? Well, for any of you interested, this is the giant command block stack that runs my magic casting system. So it has a few different systems working in tandem. First off, we have our general cast detection. This controls adding and minusing the scoreboard that you see on the right hand side there that detects if we're casting. And the whole premise is once that reaches 1,000, that's when we actually trigger our spell cast. And of course, there's a few hidden mechanics in with that. For one, we have to shift on the spot, so if we decide to move, you can see that the casting gets decreased. So if you want to move and cast, it's going to take you significantly longer to cast. In fact, sometimes it's going to be downright impossible depending on how quick you're moving. So the way this works is I am essentially placing an invisible armor stand that's now detecting whenever the player is colliding with it. So as long as the player is on top of it, it's going to cast. Other than that, we now have to determine the casting type. So that's this command block chain that you see is activated while I have the spellbook. So there's the 5 different modes, each of these different command block segments, and depending on which one is active, depends on the spellbook. So as long as we have incantation direct, redstone is placed activating these command blocks, and this allows us to summon a projectile in front of us, whichever way we're facing. So if we're facing diagonal, for instance, we still get a particle and a fireball. Perfect. Of course, each mode has a different version of casting, but the way the casting works, to put it simply, is again, I'm summoning an invisible arm stand that I'm now using to detect when it collides with a hostile, or I should say, an alternative mob. And when it does, that's when it triggers the actual spell effect. So then, how about the spell effect? Well, that's where this giant stack comes into it. So we've got 25 different rows, so each of these is a different type of spell. You can see the one that's currently activated is, of course, our fire charm. So we've got 2 sides to it. One handles the particles and the sound effects. Next, we handle the actual effect that's triggering. So for instance, we're playing the fire extinguish. We are adding our burn tag, which ties back into my status effect system. And we're also setting a fire at the entity's feet. On the opposite side, we have a bit of a different system. First, here we have our generic damage. So anytime Fireball hits something, it's going to apply instant damage and instant health, depending on the type of mob, and that's how we work out our basic damage. And then these 4 are a bit more special. So for instance, if this spell projectile were to collide with someone else's, they would then gain the properties of one another. I've built a system that allows multiple people to cast at once and affect each other's spells, and I thought that's a pretty unique system. Other than that, we also have casting modifiers. So for instance, this adds 1 to our is casting score, meaning that when you're casting Fireball, you're actually doing it quicker than a normal spell. Each spell has their own hidden multiplier or negative value that will either increase casting time or reduce it. And the same goes for all the different incantations. For instance, I have our Omega book here. This has every single charm and every type of incantation. If I were to try and cast with it, we can see that the is casting time is significantly slower. That's because I have every single effect running. So the scoreboard system is essentially at its maximum, and it's taking about 50 seconds to actually cast the spell. Plus, there's a ton of particles. But we're only interested in this one. And then the last thing to talk about is cleanup. So how am I making sure to A, delete the particles, delete the armor stand, and make sure everything doesn't seamlessly loop? Well, we are adding different tags and different effects to our different systems. So for instance, when I cast this spell, there's actually something special happening. And it's not just as simple as that. So if I grab out a command block quickly, and all we're going to type in is execute at entity type equals marker, run particle, doesn't really matter what particle, we'll just do angry villagers, 0, 0, 0, 1, make it 10, nice and simple. So now if we cast, we can actually see what's happening behind the scenes. So you can see there's a bunch of those angry villager particle effects. This is how I detect the particle or the projectile, or really it's an armor stand, how I detect the armor stand hitting something else. And the way it works is through markers. So at the armor stand's location, I'm spawning a marker in all these different positions around it to essentially create a dynamic box. This box allows us to detect collision far better than just using an armor stand, because something you may notice if you've ever tried to work with motion is at certain speeds, entities just don't trigger hitboxes. They move through one another before the game can properly detect when they're overlapping. So in order to get around that, we make stationary markers that are then deleted after a set interval. For instance, it's once their age gets to 5, so this is 5 ticks, or 1/4 of a second. As for the actual arm stand, now that is a lot easier of a process. So the arm stands I'm summoning have a particle effect. So for the most part, I think it's just luck. Really, it doesn't matter. The most important thing is I can set a duration. This means I can detect whenever an armor stand exists that doesn't have an active effect and delete it, meaning that I can give each projectile a specific life span. So for instance, the projectile of just the direct incantation has a life of 30 ticks or 1.5 seconds, and then it gets deleted. Don't think I looked at the right one. Really? 60 seconds. 2 seconds. In 2 seconds, then it's deleted. Other than that, it's a fairly simple system and just uses these small components that are then tied together to create a really dynamic and interesting system, at least in my opinion. The simple fact that you can take 5 different spell types and then 25 different actual elements and combine them in a bunch of different ways to create some pretty crazy spells. Anyway, hope you enjoyed. Thanks for watching.